Welcome to Beyond the Evidence, the place where every mystery, every clue, and every twist unravels a story like no other. Take a moment, settle in. Grab your favorite drink and get comfortable, because you're about to embark on a journey that goes beyond the facts. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. And don't forget, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Miss Marple and the Thimble Game. Chapter 1. Tea and Thimble. It was a Thursday in late spring, and the hedgerows around Nether Dean shimmered with pale blue speedwell and ox-eye daisies. The village was the kind of place where every gate creaked in a familiar way, and gossip flowed more freely than water from the taps. Miss Marple, invited to spend a fortnight with her dear friend, Miss Henrietta Blount, had quickly slipped into the quiet rhythm of country life. Morning walks, afternoon tea, and, most recently, an invitation to the Nether Dean Women's Sewing Circle. "I warn you, Jane," Henrietta had said that morning over buttered crumpets, "they're a fiercely loyal group, bit standoffish with newcomers, especially if you don't have a pincushion shaped like a hedgehog, or some similar nonsense." Miss Marple had smiled politely. "I shall bring my own needles and keep my observations to myself." The sewing circle met in the village hall, a whitewashed building with ivy curling up its sides and bunting perpetually draped across its entrance like a remnant from some forgotten jubilee. Inside, the air smelled of lavender sachets and chalk dust. Miss Marple took a quiet seat in the corner, her fingers busying themselves with a bit of hem stitching, while her eyes, ever alert, took in the women assembled. There were 11 of them, all local, all busy, and all very curious about the silver-haired stranger threading a needle with surprising dexterity. At the centre of the group sat Mrs. Evangeline Marsh, recently returned to the village after a mysterious absence of several years. She had a presence, tall, commanding, with prematurely white hair, coiled into a tight bun, and the sort of cheekbones that once would have graced a milliner's advertisement. She was leading the gathering today, explaining a new embroidery pattern in crisp, precise tones. "3 small daisies followed by the thimble stitch," she said, holding up a pale pink sampler. "It creates a lovely border." The mention of thimbles sparked chuckles from some, groans from others. "It's always thimbles with you, Ava," muttered Ruth Petley, the grocer's wife, who was known for her blunt manner. "You and your little punishments." Evangeline smiled thinly, but said nothing. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had noticed something curious. Each woman had brought her own teacup from home, a long-standing tradition apparently to avoid confusion. The cups stood in a line on a low shelf near the window, mismatched but well-loved. When the tea was poured, each woman reached instinctively for her own, except for one. Miss Daphne Cray, a shy woman in her 50s with pale hair and nervous eyes, seemed momentarily confused. Her hand hovered over 2 identical floral cups before she withdrew it and let Evangeline hand her the correct one. A small thing, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple tucked it away like a dropped stitch that might later unravel the whole pattern. As the women sipped tea and stitched daisies, Miss Marple found herself drawn into quiet conversation with Mrs. Violet Tremaine, a former nurse with gentle hands and sad eyes. "Ava's quite something, isn't she?" Violet said quietly. "She's the reason half of us sew straight." "She seems authoritative," Miss Marple replied, choosing her word carefully. Violet gave a small nod. "She's very precise. She lived in the north for a few years, ran a school for orphan girls, I believe. Not one for softness. Not even as a child. You know she once made her younger sister drink dishwater for leaving a pin on the floor." Before Miss Marple could respond, a sudden clatter broke the air. Daphne Cray had dropped her teacup. It shattered on the wooden floor. "Oh, heavens!" she said faintly, her voice trembling. "It's all right," said Violet, rising quickly. "You sit. I'll fetch the broom." But Daphne did not sit. Her face had turned a blotchy shade of grey, and her eyes widened as if she were staring at something no one else could see. She staggered once, tried to catch herself on the edge of the table, and then collapsed to the floor. There was screaming, panic. The circle of women swarmed in confusion. Miss Marple moved calmly through the group, knelt down, and checked for a pulse. Her fingers were sure but gentle. "She's gone," she said quietly. Henrietta gasped. "A heart attack?" "Most likely," murmured Ruth. She'd been looking pale for weeks and nervous, thought it was just her nerves again. Miss Marple stood slowly, her mind ticking through the moment. The confusion with the teacup, the delayed reaction, the flush of the skin. "She didn't spill the tea," she murmured. "What did you say, Jane?" Henrietta asked, turning toward her. "Nothing, dear," Miss Marple said with a soft smile. "Only that I believe I'll help Violet clear things away. Poor Daphne would have hated to leave a mess." As the others murmured in agreement, a small figure entered the hall, a child of perhaps 8, with straw-coloured hair and a crooked fringe. She was the daughter of the vicar's housekeeper and often fetched her mother in the afternoons. Oblivious to the tension, she began humming softly to herself as she tiptoed around the grown-ups. "One thimble for the truth, one thimble for the lie," she sang in a sing-song voice. "One for the secret, and one for goodbye." Miss Marple turned her head sharply. "Where did you hear that, dear?" she asked gently. The girl shrugged. "Mrs. Marsh taught me. She said it was a silly game her mummy played with her." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle, but something had changed in her eyes. A faint flicker, a recognition. A door inside her mind, shut for decades, was quietly beginning to open. She looked once more at the broken teacup, at the embroidery left half-finished in Daphne Cray's lap. And then she looked at Evangeline Marsh, who had gone utterly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, thimble glinting on her finger like a silver crown. Chapter 2. Threads from the Past. The next morning brought grey skies and a gentle drizzle over Nether Dean, softening the outlines of the cottages and turning the village green into a pale wash of damp grass. A hush had settled over the village, as though the air itself was mourning Miss Daphne Cray. Miss Marple sat by the parlour window in Miss Blount's cottage, her knitting in her lap, but forgotten. She stared out at the fogged glass, thoughts churning quietly beneath her calm surface. Henrietta bustled in with tea. "Dr. Fenwick's signed the death certificate," she said, placing the tray on the small oak table. "Heart failure, natural causes, nothing suspicious." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "And yet, Daphne didn't look ill, did she?" Henrietta hesitated. She was always a bit fluttery, timid, always jumping at sounds, but not unhealthy, not dying. "Quite so," said Miss Marple, stirring her tea gently. "And then there's that little rhyme." Henrietta frowned. "The one the vicar's daughter was humming?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, one thimble for the truth, one thimble for the lie. It has the feel of a punishment rhyme, don't you think? The sort used to scare children into obedience." "Well," Henrietta said with a faint shudder, "Ava Marsh has always been a little severe." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Severe how?" "She used to be terribly harsh with her little sister," Henrietta replied. "Olive, I think her name was, much younger and rather slow. I remember Eva locking her in the tool shed once, just for getting a stitch wrong on a sampler. Said she had to learn the thimble game properly." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her needles resumed their rhythmic click. "And this thimble game, you've heard of it before?" "Only from Eva. The rest of us thought it was nonsense." There was a pause. Rain tapped gently against the window panes. "I'd like to speak to Violet Tremaine," Miss Marple said at last. At the nurse's cottage, Mrs. Violet Tremaine lived in a modest two-room cottage on the edge of the village. A tidy garden bloomed with peonies out front, though Miss Marple noticed a patch of rosemary by the door, a herb for remembrance. Fitting, she thought. Violet welcomed her in, her eyes tired. "She was a dear soul, Daphne," she said, handing Miss Marple a warm cup of nettle tea. "Fragile, sensitive, but kind." "Did she ever speak of Eva Marsh?" Miss Marple asked gently. Violet nodded slowly. They weren't close. Daphne admired her, I think. Eva had such control, authority, but also fear. Daphne was afraid of getting things wrong around her. "She dropped her teacup yesterday," Miss Marple said, "just before she died." Violet flinched. "Yes, that clatter, I still hear it. But she didn't scream or clutch her chest, just collapsed." "Do you know if Eva poured Daphne's tea?" "No," Violet said. "Each woman takes her own cup. It's a silly tradition, but old. Eva insisted on it. She even brought that little wooden shelf to display them." Miss Marple sipped her tea in silence. Then she said softly, "And the rhyme? Do you know it?" Violet looked startled, then slowly nodded. "I heard it once. When Eva first returned to the village, she taught it to the vicar's daughter, gave her a little silver thimble, and said it was for learning to sew truthfully. I thought it was just an odd phrase, but—" "Jane, do you think she meant something more by it?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I rather think she did." A visit to the vicarage. Later that day, Miss Marple walked briskly to the vicarage. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Dalrymple, greeted her with surprise but kindness. "Eva Marsh?" she repeated. "Yes, she sometimes helps with Sunday embroidery. Gave our Sophie a little rhyme and a silver thimble. Why?" "May I see the thimble, if Sophie still has it?" The child was called. She fetched the thimble from her doll's chest, a tiny silver thing, engraved faintly with a star on one side and a cross on the other. "Eva said the star was for truth and the cross was for lies," Sophie chirped. "If I stitched wrong, I had to wear the lie side and be quiet for a whole hour." Miss Marple smiled gently, though her fingers gripped the thimble more tightly than necessary. "That's a very clever game. Did anyone else play it?" Sophie shook her head. "Only me, and sometimes Eva made me wear gloves so I couldn't stitch at all. She said I had careless fingers, just like her sister Olive." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Mrs. Dalrymple, whose brow had furrowed. After a few more pleasantries, Miss Marple stepped out into the afternoon mist, her mind a whirl. The old register. The next stop was the village archives, an unassuming stone room beside the church, watched over by Mr. Hugh Milner, a former solicitor and volunteer historian. "Eva Marsh," he mused, pulling down an old register. "Her family's been here for generations. Father was a schoolmaster, stern fellow, died during the influenza." "And her sister?" Miss Marple asked. "Olive Marsh, born 1917. Records say she was sent away in 1928. "Sent away where?" Milner hesitated. "There was a local orphan school just outside Langmere, not a pleasant place by all accounts, closed down years ago after some scandal." "Was Eva also listed as a child of the same household?" "Yes, but there's a strange gap. Look here, 1923, a note. Additional child reads, no father listed in formal arrangement, no surname, no further entries." Miss Marple stared at the faint ink. Ruth Petley's maiden name wasn't Marsh, was it?" Milner frowned. "No, I believe it was Renshaw." Miss Marple's eyes lit, just for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Milner. You've been most helpful." Back at the cottage. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly in her armchair, while Henrietta knitted by the fire. "Jane," she said, "you've got that look, that someone's about to be arrested look." Miss Marple chuckled softly. Nothing so dramatic, but I believe Eva Marsh is not the only one in this village with a hidden past. Henrietta looked up. You think Ruth Petley? I think there's a missing sister, Miss Marple said. Someone raised in cruelty, erased from the records, hidden among us. And I think Daphne Cray knew more than she should have, or remembered something she was never meant to. Do you think someone poisoned her? Miss Marple gazed into the fire. Not poison in the usual sense. I think she was conditioned, trained, perhaps from childhood, to fear disobedience, especially in the presence of that rhyme. And when she drank from a cup with the wrong thimble, or heard the rhyme in the wrong tone, something inside her gave way, like a switch pulled in the dark. Henrietta shivered. That's monstrous. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Monstrous and deliberate. Chapter 3, The Needle Remembers. The following morning, the sewing circle reconvened, not in the village hall, but in a more subdued setting, Ruth Petley's drawing room. It was a last-minute change, blamed on draughts and damp in the hall, but Miss Marple noted how smoothly Ruth took control. No one questioned her decision, not even Evangeline Marsh. The death of Daphne Cray hovered over the gathering like a faint perfume, present but not acknowledged. Tea was still poured, biscuits still passed, and needles still threaded, but the rhythm was uncertain. Words dropped into silences instead of bouncing between laughter. Miss Marple, seated near the fireplace, observed with interest. A fresh pot of Earl Grey sat on the sideboard, and the familiar teacups had returned, but something was different. They were no longer placed in a row, but jumbled in a wicker tray, as if to discourage the tradition altogether. Ruth moved between the women with a deliberate calm. No point in fussing over which cup belongs to whom, she said. We've had enough of superstitions. Evangeline's smile didn't reach her eyes. It was never about superstition. It was about order. Order, Ruth replied, her tone dry, has never been my religion. Miss Marple watched them both with quiet interest. The group fell into its work, stitching, pinning, and murmuring. Miss Marple turned to Violet Tremaine beside her. You once mentioned Eva had a younger sister named Olive. Violet nodded faintly. Yes, sweet child. Strange, though. Never spoke much. She vanished one winter. Rumour said she'd been sent to a school for the slow and unwanted. Eva never talked about her again. Miss Marple lowered her voice. And do you know if Ruth Petley had any siblings? Violet blinked. Ruth. Not that she ever said. Just then, the youngest member of the circle, a shy girl named Maggie Trent, pricked her finger with a needle and let out a soft yelp. "Ow, sorry, I'll fetch a plaster." Evangeline's voice cut through the moment. "No, use this." She pulled a small, worn thimble from her sewing basket and pressed it into Maggie's hand. The room fell oddly quiet. Maggie hesitated. Ruth stepped in, her voice uncharacteristically sharp. "That won't be necessary." Evangeline turned slowly toward her. "Why not? It's just a thimble." Ruth's eyes held hers, steady and unblinking. Because not every memory needs a relic. A silence stretched, long and uncomfortable. Miss Marple watched the tension crackle like electricity between them. Something personal, deeply buried, and dangerously close to surfacing. Keen, unexpected visit. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the old Langmere Orphan School, or what remained of it. The building had long since been converted into a poultry farm, but the caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Bradley, remembered the past well. "Ah, the Marsh girl," he said, scratching his chin. "Eva came often to visit one of the children. Not Olive, though, that one disappeared young. It was another girl, red hair, sharp tongue. Renshaw, she was called." "Do you recall her first name?" He paused. "Rosamond, a wild thing, didn't like rules, got punished often." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Punished how?" He looked uncomfortable. "With silence, mostly. No supper, no talking. Sometimes locked away for days with only her sewing, they had this game, thimble something. The thimble punishment game? That's it. The matron's idea, I think. Said it taught discipline. Do you remember what happened to Rosamond? Mr. Bradley's voice lowered. Ran off in her teens. No one came for her. Just vanished. Some said she changed her name. Knotted threads. That evening, Miss Marple and Henrietta sat again before the fire. A storm gathered in the distance, low thunder rumbling faintly beyond the hills. "Jane," Henrietta said, glancing up from her cross-stitch, "you've been pacing?" Miss Marple sat down. "Henrietta, I believe Ruth Petley was once Rosamond Renshaw, the girl from Langmere." Henrietta's eyes widened. "Ruth? But she's part of the village." "Indeed, but she's not from here originally. She arrived 20 years ago unmarried and opened the grocer's. She was competent, private, and, until recently, never spoke of her past. She avoids thimbles, changes the rules, and her hostility toward Ava is not casual. It is old. Do you think she killed Daphne?" "I don't believe so, but I believe she knows the rhyme, and I believe Daphne overheard something, perhaps a conversation or an argument, that unlocked a memory of fear so deeply buried it was fatal." Henrietta looked troubled. "But who taught Daphne the rhyme?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She rose, walked to the shelf, and picked up Henrietta's silver sewing box. She held up a small worn thimble, engraved faintly with a crooked star. "Eva gave these to children, taught them rules disguised as rhymes, and some of them learned not just to stitch, but to obey, to fear. It's a kind of conditioning." Henrietta shivered. "You're saying Daphne didn't die from poison or violence, but from fear?" Miss Marple nodded. "From psychological command, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. A memory resurfaces." That night a knock came at Henrietta's door. It was Violet Tremaine, visibly shaken, holding something wrapped in tissue. "I found this," she whispered. "In Daphne's sewing kit. I thought you should see it." Miss Marple carefully unwrapped the paper. Inside lay an old photograph, faded and creased. It showed two girls in plain uniforms. One was clearly Eva Marsh, the other had bright eyes and wild red hair. On the back, in shaky pencil, were the words, "One thimble for the truth." Miss Marple held the photograph in silence, her expression unreadable. "Daphne must have found this," Violet said. "Maybe Eva gave her the kit, or she bought it second-hand. But she saw something she recognized," Miss Marple looked up, "or someone she once knew." Chapter 4. The Woman Behind the Thread. The day after Violet Tremaine brought the photograph, the village air felt strangely tense, like the taut string of a violin just before it breaks. The sewing circle had disbanded temporarily. Out of respect, they said, though Miss Marple suspected it was more a matter of unease. In Henrietta's parlour, Miss Marple studied the faded photograph once more. Eva Marsh stood stiffly in her orphanage uniform, her braid wound tightly against her head. But the second girl, the one with fiery red curls and a crooked grin, was unmistakably not Daphne Cray. "Ruth Petley," Miss Marple murmured. Henrietta peered over her shoulder. "You sure?" Miss Marple nodded. She was Rosamond Renshaw, same eyes, same mouth. This photo proves they knew each other long before Nether Dean. But why would Ruth keep that a secret? Because the past she came from was designed to be erased, and Eva likely made sure it stayed buried. A visit to Ruth. Later that morning, Miss Marple walked the narrow path to Ruth Petley's cottage. The grocer's wife opened the door with a wary expression, her apron dusted in flour. "Come in if you must," Ruth said stiffly, "but I've no time for gossip." "I haven't come to gossip," Miss Marple replied gently. "I've come to return something." She handed her the photograph. Ruth froze. Her eyes scanned the image, then flicked up to Miss Marple's face. "Where did you find this?" "In Daphne Cray's sewing kit." Violet brought it to me. She thought it might matter." Ruth said nothing for a long time. When she did speak, her voice was tight. "I didn't give her that. She must have bought the kit second-hand. I sold some old things to the church bazaar last year." "You and Eva were at Langmere together," Miss Marple said. Ruth didn't reply. "Your name then was Rosamond," Miss Marple continued. "And Eva taught you the thimble game, didn't she?" Ruth's expression didn't change, but her hands gripped the photograph tighter. "She taught all of us. That's how she got to be in charge. Even the matrons listened to her. She had ways of making girls obey without laying a finger on them. She controlled through fear." "She controlled through silence," Ruth said flatly. "She made you believe that mistakes meant shame, and shame meant silence. You wore the lie thimble if you dropped a stitch, if you talked out of turn, if you cried." Miss Marple said nothing. She simply let the silence stretch, giving Ruth the space she needed. "I ran away at 16, Ruth went on. "Changed my name. Promised myself I'd never wear another thimble. Never sew again, in fact. But it's funny. The past doesn't stay buried, no matter how deep you put it." Daphne remembered something. Ruth's jaw tightened. Ava must have started playing the same games again. Quiet ones, private ones. I saw the signs. Daphne flinching, her hands shaking. Once I found her staring at her own thumb, like she could still feel something there. "A bruise?" "Not a bruise," Ruth said. "An indentation, the kind that comes from wearing a thimble too tight for too long." Evangeline's visit. That evening, as dusk folded over the village, Henrietta returned from an errand with a furrowed brow. "You'll never guess who visited Ruth this afternoon." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Evangeline Marsh?" Henrietta nodded. The two of them sat in the back garden for over half an hour. No tea, no stitching, just quiet talking. "And what did Ruth look like afterward?" "Like someone who'd seen a ghost," Henrietta said. "She didn't even speak to me when I passed her gate." Miss Marple rose and walked to the window. The lane outside was quiet, shadows lengthening like fingers across the hedgerows. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. "She's tying up threads," Miss Marple said softly. Henrietta blinked. "What do you mean?" "She's sensed that someone knows the truth. Perhaps she suspects Ruth, perhaps someone else. Either way, she's tightening the net, just as she did in the orphanage." Henrietta looked anxious. "Do you think she'd hurt Ruth?" "I think she already has," Miss Marple replied. "Years ago. Clues in the dust." That night, Miss Marple asked Violet Tremaine for one more favour. "Daphne's belongings, have they been claimed?" "Not yet," Violet said. "Her cousin is due next week. Why?" "I'd like to see her sampler." Violet brought the unfinished embroidery from a box in the spare room. It was a soft linen square with dainty daisies along the edge, but something about the pattern made Miss Marple pause. In the lower corner, the daisies broke pattern and curved upward, almost like a winding path. At the end of it, embroidered in faint grey thread, was a tiny object, a thimble. Miss Marple ran her finger over the stitches. They were uneven, almost shaky. The grey thread was out of place, hidden from casual view. "She was trying to tell us something," she murmured. "A warning?" Violet asked. "A name," Miss Marple replied. "Or a memory. A plan takes shape." By morning, Miss Marple had made up her mind. It was time to bring Ruth and Ava into the same room, with witnesses. The setting had to be familiar, neutral, and most importantly, quiet enough for the truth to be heard clearly. "The village hall?" Miss Marple said to Violet and Henrietta. "Tomorrow? I'll send for them both." Henrietta looked worried. "You'll confront Ava directly." Miss Marple shook her head. No, I'll let the thimbles speak first. Chapter 5. The Game Revealed. The village hall smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. The curtains had been drawn against the morning sun, leaving the space bathed in gentle shadows. On the central table lay a folded piece of white linen, Daphne Cray's unfinished sampler, next to a small wooden box. Miss Marple sat quietly beside the hearth, knitting needles resting in her lap. Violet Tremaine stood by the door, arms folded. Henrietta sat near the window, pretending to sort thread, but watching the clock. At precisely 10 o'clock, Evangeline Marsh entered, wrapped in a dark coat with a silver brooch gleaming like a dagger at her throat. "Miss Marple," she said curtly, "I was told this was a memorial gathering?" "In a sense," Miss Marple replied. "Please have a seat." Moments later, Ruth Petley arrived. She wore a plain grey dress and no makeup. Her face was composed, but her knuckles were white where they gripped her handbag. The two women did not look at one another. Miss Marple placed her knitting aside. "Thank you both for coming. I've asked you here to speak about something delicate. Something that began long before Daphne Cray's death." Ruth exhaled slowly. "You found the photo." Evangeline's head snapped toward her. "What photo?" Miss Marple opened the wooden box and removed the old photograph of two girls in uniform. She placed it between them on the table. "You both knew each other from Langmere Orphan School," Miss Marple said calmly. "Eva Marsh and Rosamond Renshaw." Eva's face tightened. "This is absurd." "It's the truth," Ruth said quietly. "We were both there. You remember the rhyme, don't you?" Miss Marple watched her closely. Ruth didn't blink. Her voice remained even, though her fingers trembled slightly. "One thimble for the truth, one thimble for the lie," she said softly. "One for the silence and one for goodbye." Eva rose abruptly. "This is foolishness." Miss Marple didn't move. "Miss Marsh, when Daphne Cray died, the doctor assumed heart failure, but the body showed signs of stress, rapid skin mottling, rapid collapse, clenched fingers, not the usual symptoms of a calm death." "She was frail," Eva said. "Everyone knew that." "Not frail," Miss Marple corrected. "Conditioned. She had been trained, like others before her, to react to certain triggers with fear so deep it took hold of her body." Eva's expression changed. Her mouth opened slightly, but she said nothing. Miss Marple opened the linen sampler. "This was found in Daphne's kit," she said. "She embroidered a thimble in grey thread hidden in the corner. She was trying to leave a message, and before she collapsed, she reached for the wrong cup, or perhaps the right one, the one marked by fear." Ava's voice was low now. "You have no proof?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "Then let us listen." She turned to Ruth and nodded once. Ruth's voice, though hoarse, carried across the room like a hymn from a forgotten chapel. "One thimble for the truth, one thimble for the lie." Eva flinched. A subtle shift, a flicker of the eye, a small intake of breath. "What? One thimble for the silence?" Miss Marple stood and approached the table. "And one," Ruth said slowly, "for goodbye." Ava's face turned ashen. There was a silence in the room, heavy and absolute. Miss Marple spoke softly. "You used fear like thread, Miss Marsh. You stitched it into people until they couldn't speak without trembling. Daphne was fragile, but you made her break." Ava sat back down heavily. Her voice, when it came, was strangely calm. "She found the sampler," she said. "The one Olive made. I'd kept it. Silly of me, but I couldn't throw it away." "Olive?" Violet asked. "My sister," Eva whispered. "She was delicate, always making mistakes, always crying. Father hated that. He made me correct her." Later, at Langmere, I tried to teach the same discipline. It was the only way to keep the order. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And when Ruth returned to the village, you realized your control was at risk. I didn't kill Daphne, Eva said, not directly. No, Miss Marple said, but you reminded her of something she had spent her life trying to forget. The rhyme, the rules, the punishment, that was enough. Ruth looked at Eva for the first time. You made me ashamed of myself for years. You made me believe I was broken. Eva stared at the table. So was I. Aftermath. Inspector Graves was summoned later that day. No charges were filed. There was no criminal act to pursue. But Eva Marsh left Netherdean within the week, her cottage sold quietly to a solicitor from Devon. No one saw her go. Ruth returned to her shop. She added a new section near the window, hand-stitched bookmarks and tiny fabric roses. She never used a thimble. As for Miss Marple, she spent one more afternoon with Violet Tremaine. They sat beneath the climbing roses, sipping tea from mismatched cups. Did you ever think a rhyme could kill? Violet asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Words are like needles, my dear. Used well, they can mend a heart. But when misused, oh, they leave scars no one sees. Chapter 6. The Stitch That Didn't Belong. A week had passed since Evangeline Marsh left Netherdean. Her departure had not stirred the village as much as expected, just a single removal van at dawn and a note left with the vicar saying she would not be returning. Most of the villagers accepted it as a private matter, as small communities often do, but Miss Marple was not entirely satisfied. I feel, she said to Henrietta one evening, that there's one more knot to untangle. Henrietta glanced up from her book. She's gone, Jane, and Ruth seems lighter since. Why look further? Because, Miss Marple said, something still doesn't match. She rose from her armchair and fetched the linen sampler again, the one Daphne Cray had been working on before her death. I've studied this pattern many times, Miss Marple said. Look here. The flowers curve into a path, but there's one stitch near the top corner, right beside the final daisy. It's not Daphne's work. Henrietta leaned forward. How can you tell? The thread tension, Miss Marple said. Daphne stitched with a left slant. Her tension pulled the thread tight in one direction, but this one daisy, it curves the opposite way, and the thread is a lighter shade of grey. Henrietta blinked. You think someone added to the sampler after her death? Yes. And recently, Miss Marple reached into her bag and unfolded a note Violet Tremaine had delivered that morning. It was written on creamy paper in a tight, formal script. Dear Miss Marple, you were right about Eva. She broke people, not by force, but by making us doubt our own instincts. I feel I should thank you, but I also feel the past is not quite done with us. Yours are. Ah, Henrietta said slowly. That must be Ruth. That's what I assumed, Miss Marple replied, but the handwriting is wrong. She handed Henrietta a grocery list Ruth had scribbled last month. It was entirely different. Broad loops, rounded letters, slightly smudged ink. This note, Miss Marple said, was not written by Ruth. Henrietta looked alarmed. Then who? Miss Marple rose, went to the bureau, and returned with another item, the church newsletter. Folded in the centre was a column titled Needle and Spirit, Reflections from the Sewing Circle, written by a new contributor. Author listed only as R, Miss Marple said. But the writing matches the thank you note perfectly. And the language, listen to this line. Discipline is best stitched with gentle fingers, not steel thimbles. Henrietta's eyes widened. That's poetic. Who would write like that? A woman with guilt, Miss Marple said softly. But not remorse. The unexpected guest. The next morning brought unexpected news. Ruth Petley had fallen ill. Violet Tremaine had found her collapsed behind the counter, trembling and pale, murmuring something about a smell. Lavender and brass polish, she'd whispered, like the corridors of the old school. Violet had sat with her through the night. When Miss Marple arrived, Ruth was sitting up in bed, but her hand shook as she poured tea. "She was in my shop," Ruth whispered. "Last week. I didn't see her face, just her coat. The same one Eva used to wear, navy blue, silver buttons. I thought it was a dream, but then I found this in the waste bin." She handed Miss Marple a strip of linen, torn from an old sampler. It bore a single stitched line. "One thimble for silence." Henrietta, standing beside Miss Marple, gasped. "She's still here," Ruth said flatly. "Eva, or someone like her. A new suspect." That evening, Miss Marple walked the path behind the church, where a small row of cottages housed the newer residents of Netherdean. She stopped at number 3, once a gardener's cottage, now let out by the parish council. The door opened before she knocked. "You've come," said Sarah Blaine, a quiet woman who had recently joined the sewing circle after moving from Devon. She was polite, middle-aged, with dark hair tucked neatly under a scarf, and a smile that rarely reached her eyes. "May I come in?" Miss Marple asked. Sarah nodded. The interior of the cottage was sparse, but orderly. A sewing basket sat open on the table, with spools of grey and cream thread. On the wall above the mantel was a framed sampler, not a decorative one, but a near replica of the one Daphne had been stitching. "I admired Daphne's work," Sarah said calmly. "Such gentle fingers." "You copied it," Miss Marple said. Sarah shrugged. "Imitation is a form of flattery." Miss Marple didn't sit. "You used to work at Langmere, didn't you?" There was a pause. "Briefly," Sarah said. "I was a pupil teacher there, under Eva Marsh." "And your surname then was not Blaine. It was Rosamond Renshaw, the real one." Sarah's expression didn't flicker. "You took the identity Ruth used to escape," Miss Marple continued. "You let her carry the burden of your past. All the while, you were the one Eva trained most ruthlessly." "Eva trained me," Sarah said softly. "But she didn't break me. Not like Olive, not like the others. I learned how to endure and how to disappear." "And Daphne?" Miss Marple asked. "She reminded me of Olive," Sarah said. "All nerves, all softness." Eva started again. Small comments, little punishments. "I tried to stop her." Miss Marple looked at her closely. "But it was you who added the last stitch." Sarah smiled faintly. "I wanted her to be remembered. That final thimble, it wasn't a threat. It was a mark of grief." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the letter?" Sarah stepped closer. "I wrote it, but not to thank you, to warn you." Miss Marple didn't flinch. "Is Eva still in the village?" Sarah said nothing. Then, quietly, she opened her sewing basket and placed a single item on the table. A navy blue button, old and polished, bearing a faint symbol. "Eva never left," she said. "She changed her name. She's hiding in plain sight. Chapter 7. The Last Thimble." The air in Netherdean seemed sharper that week, as if the whole village held its breath. Children kept close to their mothers, and the sewing circle no longer met. The hall's bunting drooped in the rain, forgotten. Yet Miss Marple's eyes were brighter than ever, her mind catching threads no one else noticed. She sat with Henrietta and Violet Tremaine in the parlour, the navy blue button Sarah Blaine had given her resting on the table like a clue in plain sight. "A button," Henrietta said. "It proves nothing." "It proves plenty," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Eva Marsh always wore her navy coat with these distinctive buttons, Sarah swears she found this in her own cottage bin, not her sewing basket, which means someone else was there, someone discarding the last fragment of disguise. Ava, Violet murmured. Or someone Ava trained, Miss Marple said. We must be precise. The disguises. The next morning, Miss Marple walked the village lanes alone. She stopped at the vicarage, at the grocer's, and finally at the small cottage where Sarah Blaine lived. Every time she asked the same quiet question. Who last visited you? Most shrugged, uncertain. But at Sarah's, a neighbour recalled seeing a figure 2 nights earlier, tall with a scarf wound tightly about her head. Could have been Sarah herself, the neighbour said, but her walk was sharper, quick, determined. Miss Marple thanked her and turned away, deep in thought. Eva Marsh had left Netherdean, or so it seemed, but Sarah's words rang in her ears. She never left. She changed her name. The more Miss Marple considered, the clearer it became. Eva had always thrived on control. Disappearing into shadows was not her style. No, she would reinvent herself, and where better than in the very circle she commanded? The vicar's revelation. At the vicarage that afternoon, Miss Marple lingered after tea. The vicar, a mild man with spectacles perched on his nose, leafed absently through the parish ledger. "Curious thing," he said. "I was reviewing last year's records, our sewing circle donation list. There are 3 names signed with the initial E. Evangeline, of course, but also Eleanor Marsh." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Eleanor?" "Yes." She claimed to be a distant cousin, paid for new hymnals, attended service once or twice. Quiet, respectable sort? Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. Not a cousin, a mask. The empty cottage. That evening, Miss Marple, Henrietta, and Violet walked together to Sarah Blaine's cottage. Sarah was waiting, pale but resolute. "You've discovered it, haven't you?" she asked. "Part of it," Miss Marple said. Ava didn't leave as Evangeline Marsh. She stayed as Eleanor. She's been here, moving between cottages, hidden by trust. Sarah's eyes flicked downward. "She came to me. The night Daphne died, said Ruth would ruin everything if she spoke. Told me I was the only one who understood discipline. She wanted me to choose, her or Ruth." "And you?" Miss Marple asked softly. "I told her I'd endured enough." Sarah's voice cracked. "But I never thought she'd go to Daphne." Miss Marple studied her. "And yet Daphne embroidered the thimble into her sampler." She knew something. Perhaps Eva slipped, mentioned the rhyme, or showed her an old stitch. Enough to unearth the fear again. Henrietta shivered. That poor woman. The gathering. Miss Marple arranged one final meeting at the church hall, summoning Ruth, Sarah, Violet, and Inspector Graves, who had been keeping discreet watch. At the centre table, she placed the sampler, the photograph, and the navy button. When the group assembled, the air felt charged, almost ritualistic. "I have asked you here," Miss Marple began, "because the truth is not yet complete. Daphne Cray's death was not merely an accident of fear. It was the product of an old game revived, and of one woman's refusal to let go of her power." The door creaked open. A figure stepped inside. She was dressed in plain black, her hair tucked under a widow's veil. But her posture, erect, commanding, was unmistakable. "Ava," Ruth whispered. The woman lifted the veil. Her eyes were calm, her mouth a line of steel. "Eleanor Marsh," Miss Marple said gently, "your last disguise." Ava gave a thin smile. "You're cleverer than most, Miss Marple, but not clever enough." Inspector Graves stepped forward. "You'll come with me." Ava raised her chin. "On what charge? I killed no one." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "No court will convict you, Miss Marsh, but you killed through memory. You stitched fear so tightly into others that they carried it like a second skin. Daphne's heart stopped. Yes, but it was your hand on the thread. Ava said nothing. Her silence was louder than denial. A break in the circle. Ruth stepped forward. Her voice was low, but firm. I won't wear your shame anymore. You broke me once, not again. Eva's expression faltered for the first time. She glanced at Sarah, but Sarah looked away. Miss Marple gathered the sampler and photograph into her bag. The thimble game is over, she said, and no one here will play it again. Inspector Graves led Eva Marsh, Eleanor, Evangeline, whatever name she claimed, out of the hall. She did not resist. Quiet aftermath. That night, Miss Marple sat by the fire with Henrietta and Violet. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp with the smell of wet earth. Henrietta sighed. I never thought fear itself could be a weapon. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, my dear, fear is the sharpest needle of all. It pierces without leaving a mark. And Eva? Violet asked softly. She will vanish again, Miss Marple said. But this time her power is gone. A stitch undone cannot be remade. Chapter 8. The Last Stitch Cut. The bells of Netherdean Church tolled softly on Sunday morning, their sound rolling over the rooftops like a hymn for peace. Villagers gathered in hushed groups after service, whispering about Ava Marsh's arrest. Some pitied her, others whispered darkly about her cruelty, but none could quite grasp how a rhyme and a thimble could have killed a woman. Miss Marple, sitting quietly with Henrietta and Violet Tremaine beneath the lich gate, sipped her tea from a small flask Henrietta had brought. Her eyes, calm and bright, surveyed the restless crowd. She has unsettled them, Violet said softly. They want something neat, something they can understand. And so they shall have it, Miss Marple replied. This afternoon I will explain it plainly. A gathering in the hall. By afternoon, the village hall was full. Inspector Graves had agreed to let Eva remain in custody nearby until the matter was explained. The villagers came, curious and fearful in equal measure. Miss Marple stood at the front, her shawl draped neatly, her knitting bag at her side. She looked like nothing more than a gentle old lady about to discuss patterns and parsnips. Yet when she began to speak, silence fell. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, we are gathered because one of our own, Miss Daphne Cray, died in this very hall. Though the doctor declared her death natural, I must tell you it was not so. A ripple ran through the crowd. Daphne died because of something called the thimble game. It was a cruel punishment devised at Langmere Orphan School many years ago. Girls were made to wear thimbles marked for truth or lie, silence or shame. To disobey meant hours of isolation. To fail meant ridicule. Over time, fear became instinct. An instinct, ladies and gentlemen, can kill. Miss Marple held up the faded sampler. Daphne remembered the game. Perhaps Ava whispered the rhyme. Perhaps she saw a thimble pressed too tightly upon her thumb. That memory returned with such force that her body could not endure it. Fear took her life as surely as poison. Gasps rippled again. "And who taught this game?" Miss Marple asked. "Eva Marsh. She was trained herself, and she in turn trained others. She believed order was everything. Even now she claimed she did not kill. Yet her discipline was the deadliest of weapons." Eva speaks. Eva Marsh, seated under Inspector Graves's watch, lifted her chin. Her voice was low, but steady. "They needed rules," she said. "Without rules, children rot. I made them strong." "No," Ruth Petley said firmly, standing from her chair. "You made us afraid, and fear is not strength. It is chains." Sarah Blaine stepped forward too, her hands trembling, but her eyes clear. You made me wear the lie thimble until I believed I was nothing. That is not strength either. That is cruelty dressed as discipline." Ava's lips pressed thin, but she did not reply. Miss Marple's final threads. Miss Marple looked around the room, her voice quiet but carrying. Daphne was not the first to suffer. Ruth and Sarah carried scars for decades. Olive Marsh, the sister Eva never speaks of, was broken before she even grew. Each one of them bore fear stitched into their hearts, but now the stitching is undone. She folded the sampler gently. This is why Daphne embroidered the thimble, not as a warning, but as a cry for release. She wanted the truth remembered. Miss Marple turned to Eva. "You see, Miss Marsh, threads can bind, but they can also fray. And once frayed, they can never be woven into silence again." The release. Inspector Graves rose. "Eva Marsh will be taken away. No court may punish her for murder, but she will face charges for fraud and deception under her false names. She will not return here." Eva's eyes swept the hall one last time. For a moment, her gaze lingered on Ruth. Not pleading, not angry, simply searching for recognition. But Ruth turned away. Eva was led out, her steps still precise, though her power had drained away. Peace restored. In the weeks that followed, Nether Dean slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The sewing circle resumed under Ruth's leadership. The tradition of mismatched teacups was abandoned. Now all shared the same plain white set, as if to prove equality among them. Sarah Blaine moved away, leaving only a note. "I will stitch my life anew where no rhymes remain." No one heard from her again. Ruth, meanwhile, began teaching young girls basic sewing, but with laughter and song rather than rules. She refused to own a thimble. "Needles prick," she told them, "but that's life. A finger heals." Miss Marple's reflection. One late afternoon, Miss Marple and Henrietta walked the lane toward the meadow, the sky awash in soft gold. A thrush sang from the hedgerow, sweet and defiant. Henrietta said, "Do you ever tire, Jane, seeing the worst in people?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear, I don't see the worst. I see the truth. And truth is rather like thread. It may knot, it may fray, but if you follow it patiently, it always leads you back to the hand that holds the needle." She paused, gazing toward the hall where Daphne had fallen. The tragedy is not that one woman died, it is that many lived with fear, but fear, once named, loses its grip. Henrietta slipped her arm through hers. "And what of Eva?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "She will live her days with her own silence. And that perhaps is the heaviest thimble of all."